Feeling silly again today, so I thought I'd hit another really low stakes topic. That is, in 2024, now, as we're thinking about getting a new James Bond, would or should James Bond wear a Rolex? Let's get into it after the intro. Hi, I'm Pete McConville, and welcome to my channel where I overthink, overanalyze, and geek out on watches. And I've been in a bit of a silly mood lately, so another silly video. And today I'm going to ask whether a fictional character being recast and being therefore kind of reinvented should or should not wear a Rolex. It is, as I said, a pretty low stakes question, but I'm feeling in a low stakes kind of day. So anyway, that's what I'm going to talk about today. If you don't want to get to the end, I'm going to tell you right now that my answer is no, he shouldn't. Okay, now let's get into why this is a discussion at all. Okay, so there's a lot of people, and this was in some way inspired by an article I read recently over at Watches of Espionage, where he was quite categorical. Absolutely, James Bond should wear a Rolex. That is canon. That is what Ian Fleming put James Bond in when he wrote the original books. That is what the first iteration of James Bond in film was wearing. So for a lot of people, that's it. That's done. It's close the book, move on. James Bond should, once wore a Rolex, should always wear a Rolex. Discussion over. I kind of understand that, but then my first reaction was, imagine if Ian Fleming had instead been a Movado fan or an Invicta fan in the 1950s. Would you still think that regardless of what's happened to those brands, he should still be wearing a Movado or an Invicta, or you can pick any one number of brands whose glory has kind of been tarnished in the meantime? I don't think it would be hard to argue that no, he should probably move on from his Movado, because that's a brand whose meaning has changed completely from 1953 to 2024. And that idea that as a brand's meaning changes, as what it says changes the context and changes what our fictional character should be wearing, is exactly why I don't think James Bond should wear a Rolex today in 2024. Okay, so having now mentioned the word context, let's go back and look at the context within which Ian Fleming put a Rolex on the wrist of James Bond. So the books were written 1953 to 1967. That first tranche of James Bond movies with Sean Connery, where he wore mostly Rolex, was 1962 to 1974. There was some alternatives in there. I think there was a Breitling and a Gruen in there somewhere, but predominantly that first phase was James Bond's Rolex period. So we're talking broadly 1953 to like 75, 72, 73. Okay, so during that time, a couple of things to note. One, Rolex was relatively young. The Rolex company was less than 50 years old at the start of that period. It was not well established. It was not well known. It was not an obvious choice for anyone to pick against a lot of much older, much more established Swiss watch brands. Rolex too. During that time, Rolex was not the Rolex we think of now, this slow and steady, iterative, improving company slowly chipping away at excellence. Back then, Rolex was this highly dynamic, highly creative, explosive company that was constantly right on the bleeding edge of what watches could do. Between 1953 and 1971, you got brand spanking new, never seen before, the Explorer, the Submariner, the GMT Master, the Deep Sea. We got the Milgauss, the Air King, the Cosmograph Daytona, the Sea Dweller. In 71, this period of creativity pretty much came to a halt with the Explorer 2. All of these watches, we were getting an entirely new, never seen before collection from Rolex, doing things that no one else had ever done in the space of a 10-year period. I mean, that's hard to believe when now 10 years separates the release of, for example, the Sky Dweller and the 1908. I mean, there's now 10 years between new Rolexes, not a new watch every second year. And also at that time, what Rolex was doing, and let's say compared to, say, Omega, is they were bringing out watches which were clearly very tool oriented. The Rolex Submariner that Sean Connery wore in Dr. No, for example, at the time would have competed with, say, an Omega Speedmaster, Seamaster. They were both about the same price, around about $150 each. But if you look at the Seamaster, it's really emphasizing its luxury. It's kind of, if we look at it now, and probably even then, it was an old man's watch. It was a watch that looked backwards. On the other hand, if you look at the Rolex Submariner, particularly if you try and do it try and put yourself in the time, that's very much a young man's watch. That's a thruster's watch. That's a watch of someone who's moving forward, keeping up with the times. And that's very much where James Bond is and tries to still be. James Bond is not old and conservative and tried and true. James Bond knows more than anybody else in the room. James Bond is ahead of everyone else in the room. James Bond is at where other people want to get to. He's constantly ahead of the pack. So if you think about who James Bond is, he knows more than other people. He's ahead of where they're at. He's not obvious. He's, in that space where technology is evolving and moving forward and there's new designs all the time. Then he's clearly, and that suited Rolex at the time of writing, 53 to the early 70s. That was Rolex. But now it is not. Now Rolex is the obvious choice. It's the one everyone knows. It's the luxury choice compared to pretty much any other watch in and around that price range. Rolex is the old man's choice. It's the fuddy-duddy conservative choice, the safe choice. It's everything James Bond is not. So as canon be damned, the number one Rolex does not suit who James Bond is. There is, of course, another problem with the idea of in 2024 giving James Bond a Rolex, which is he'd probably end up therefore wearing the same watch as the villain he's hunting down. Because the truth is, today, you're more likely to see Rolex on the wrist of the bad guy in a movie. This is from an article that Time and Tide did a couple of years ago on why Rolex was used as Patrick Bateman from American Psycho's watch, and why Rolex was so unhappy about it. But also, as I said, why it was chosen in the first place. If you just want your watch to broadcast the size of your wallet to the widest possible audience, Rolex is the status symbol par excellence. That's why, in the movies particularly, Rolex watches are often used as shorthand for demented capitalism. Think of Alec Baldwin in Glengarry Glen Ross. The aggressive baller from head office scathingly berates a room of salesmen with the line, "You see this watch? That watch cost more than your car." The article goes on to say the problem with Patrick Bateman's Datejust was not that it was ever going to make the Rolex the serial killer's watch of choice. The real issue is that this noisy patronage of the brand positioned Rolex as the logical choice for the ultra-mercenary and materialistic. Now, I know that Rolex is far more than that. I know that Rolex they make excellent watches. They have a fine history. They do all of this stuff that you can be justly proud of. And if you own a Rolex, good on you. I'm happy for you. But that doesn't take away from the fact that in popular culture, in the world at large, Rolex is seen as they say here, the watch of the mercenary, the materialistic, the vanishingly shallow, the status seeker. In that environment, you simply, as I said, James Bond doesn't wear a Rolex. The people James Bond has been hired to find and kill, they wear a Rolex. One thing I would note is I've been very careful not to say what I think James Bond should wear. In reality, he would almost certainly wear a G-Shock. Now, a lot of you are going to be saying, no, he would wear something like a Garmin or a smartwatch of some sort. Actually, I have a suspicion he wouldn't. Those watches aren't allowed inside MI6 headquarters. They're not allowed inside most of the command centers that James Bond would go to. They would represent a massive security risk. So I actually suspect he doesn't use anything that's got a Bluetooth connectivity. As I said, a G-Shock, God forbid, something like an Omega X33 or a Breitling Aerospace would probably make more sense. Accurate, functional, does everything you need, has no Bluetooth, has no Wi-Fi, has no GPS, so therefore doesn't represent the sort of security risks that a smartwatch does. So anyway, like I said, I'm not going to die in a ditch over that. I'd need to think about that a lot more. Anyway, so that's it. I've been Pete McConville. This has been my silly little discussion about what a fictional character might wear if he was going to wear a watch at all. Interested in your comments below. Do you think I'm wrong? Do you think I'm right? What do you think he would wear? Put it all down below. Get those engagement numbers up. Like, subscribe, do all that sort of stuff, and we will see each other later.